So this first question asks us to find the implied domain of y is equal to 1 over x minus 2 plus 1. Whenever finding implied domain, we need to think about the restrictions of numbers. The main two that are used for most purposes are when dividing, we can't have 0, and when square rooting, we can't have a negative 1. Okay? So in this case, what we're doing is we're dividing by x minus 2, and since we can't divide by 0, x minus 2 cannot equal 0. This is the only restriction for this function. So if x minus 2 cannot equal 0, we can essentially just treat this as equality and move the negative 2 to the other side. So therefore we get x can't be equal to 2. Again, this is the only restriction on our function. So the implied domain for x is R, which represents all real numbers, but we just exclude 2. So we exclude this using the exclusion backslash, and then we use a squiggly line to represent our 2. For the next question, we have a square root. We have y is equal to the square root of 2x minus 1 and then plus 2 on the outside. So again, the restriction for this one is that we can't square root a negative number. So everything underneath the square root, in general, has to be greater or equal to 0. Obviously, that's just the same as not being negative. So therefore, in this case, 2x minus 1 is always greater or equal to 0. Again, we treat this as an equality and we just rearrange everything. So we move the 1 to the other side. So we're going to get 2x is greater or equal to 1. And then we divide by 2 to get x is greater or equal to 1/2. This is sufficient for our domain as it already implies that x can be any number that's greater or equal to 1/2. And that would be our implied domain. The last question is a bit trickier. We have a combination of the two. So we can see that we're dividing by something and we're also square rooting that as well. So in this case, x minus 3, x minus 5 with the square root cannot be negative. But at the same time, it also cannot be 0 because we're dividing by the square root of that. So when I say cannot be negative and cannot be 0, I'm referring to the quadratic that's underneath the square root. So I'm referring to x minus 3, x minus 5. So we will analyze this and use this to determine the implied domain. So to help us analyze it, what we'll do is we'll sketch it. So this is just a positive parabola with intercepts at 3 and 5. And as I said before, it cannot be negative and it cannot be 0. So the only valid points are this part here, not including the x-intercept, because again, it cannot be 0, which is where our x-intercept lies. But it could also be this left-hand branch here. So these are the only two valid regions for our domain. Let's just look at one at a time. For the first one, we start from the left-hand side, which is negative infinity, and we could go all the way to 3, but it cannot equal our intercept value, which is 3. So we use a round bracket for exclusive. The second branch, we start off at 5. Again, it cannot equal 0, so we have to exclude our x-intercept of 5 by using a round bracket, and we could go all the way to the right to infinity. So these two, groups of values define our implied domain. Therefore, x is an element of negative infinity to 3, and then we use the union to combine the two separate domains together. And we start off at 5 again and go to infinity. So this is our implied domain for this function here.